In our last lecture, we looked at the Greeks. And now we're going to move over to the Italian boot, and we're going to look at Etruscan art and some Roman art. So this image here is a depiction of the she-wolf at the inception of Rome. And it's made from bronze, made out of bronze. It's got glass paste eyes. It's 33 inches high. And it's actually made by Etruscan artists. And I've given you a link to the founding of the Roman Empire and the story of this sculpture. So if you click on this link, you can read all about the founding of Rome. So here's our map, my favorite. And so at first we're going to look at Etruria and Cerveteri, and just so we know where Rome is. So if you cast your eyes down to the boot of Italy, and then you can see this little inset, you can find Rome up to the upper left of the inset near the Tyrrhenian Sea. Then just above that is Cerveteri, and Etruria is actually the top part of the boot of Italy along the edge of the sea. So Cerveteri is a city, Rome is a city, Etruria is an area of land. So if you clicked on that link, which I hope you did, you read the story of Romulus and Remus. And so this particular she-wolf doesn't have the twins in it, but there is a composite of the she-wolf and the twins. And it's a composite of both Roman and Etruscan art. So Rome, by legend, was founded in 753. The Etruscans created the wolf around 500, but the Romans added a sculpture of children to it in about 15th century CE. So it's an image of the way themes of Romans and Etruscans combined together to create this legend. And Romulus and Remus are twin sons of the god Mars and a mortal woman. And then they were nursed by a she-wolf. So the upshot is that ancient Rome was founded from the gods. But first we're going to look at the Etruscan civilization, which is very little known civilization. So again, here's our map, and Etruria is right up at the very top of the Italian boot. So here's just a few bullet points about it, and you can read more about it in your book. We had a people called Villanovans, and they occupied all of North and West Italy. And then in the middle of Italy, there was a whole lot of Italian language speaking people. In 750 BCE, Greece established colonies in both Italy and Sicily. So you can look at that date. That's early. That's before the Greek civilization. And so we've gone back in time a little bit, is the point that I'm making. And so in the 7th and 6th century BCE, the Etruscans gained control of northern and central Italy. So that is that area, Etruria, that was marked on your map, which is, if you've been to Italy, you already know, is modern Tuscany. So not only was the soil rich with metal ore, the climate was great for growing things, but they're also great sailors, they were merchants, they were good at trade, they were a very peaceable people, but they were very rich and they were very good at what they did. They were inspired by the Greeks and Romans. They had seen Greeks and Roman people, but they didn't copy their art very much. Although you will see that a lot of their art is similar but different. I know that sounds like a riddle, but often that's the way it is. It's not that they're copying, but the ideas are the same, the gods are the same, so it's this collective consciousness, if you will. So the Etruscans were at the height of their power in the 6th century BCE, so 200 years before Classical Greek period, if you're keeping track of the timelines. And it was the same time that Latin-speaking Romans began to gain power. So by 509, Rome overthrew Etruria, and the Roman Empire just sort of encompassed the entire Mediterranean region. So they were stronger. They just kind of engulfed the Etrurians, if you will. So this is a architectural artifact from Perugia from the 2nd century BCE, and this is a Etruscan city. It's built by Etruscans, and so it's a precursor of Rome. So in the 2nd century BCE, this gate of Perugia is anticipating the Roman use of the arch. It's a round arch that's extending to create a semicircular barrel vault over the passageway. So you can see that it's sort of extending out, and notice there's a person in the bottom of this photo, it gives you a sense of the massive scale of this. So just so you know, the round arch was not invented by the Etruscans or the Romans. We've seen round arches before, right, in Macedonia, but the Romans and Etruscans were the first to make a great use of it like this. So it's not like the corbelled arch. The round arch is made of precisely cut stones, which are called voussoirs. So if you look at the top of this arch, you can see all these many, many stones that are cut and carved so that they sit next to each other to go around the top of this arch. That's a very different way of arranging the stone from the corbelling that we saw in the beehive tombs, for example. And I thought that this would probably be a good place to put a vocabulary list for you. My suggestion is that you print this out or copy this down and just sort of mark a definition for each one of these things, because it's going to make it easier for you going forward. Plus, I have vocabulary quizzes on all of these. So, during the 7th and 6th centuries, the Etruscans are controlling most of central Italy in Etruria. So, they had a confederation of 12 independent city-states. And this confederation stretched from north of Rome up into northern Italy. So, that round arch that I just showed you is the type of architecture that they would use to build these city-states. They were, of course, as you remember, a city-state is fortified and independent. Each one would have its own king. And so when the Roman Republic was founded in 509, the Etruscan ended up being absorbed into the Roman Empire. So what did their art look like? Well, this is an Etruscan temple sculpture, and they made huge terracotta sculptures. Now, terracotta is much lighter than stone. They didn't have access to the stone that the Greeks and Romans had, so they got very, very good at creating terracotta, and they put them up on top of their temples. And you can see this has sort of like this archaic smile. It's reminiscent of archaic Kouros figures, but the action is different, plus it's clothed. This is a burial chamber from the Tomb of the Reliefs in Cerveteri from the 3rd century BCE. So interestingly, Etruscan beliefs about the afterlife might have been very similar to Egyptians. We do know they placed their dead in rock-cut tombs, and the tombs were laid out like small towns. We have some of these. And they carved out objects and rendered them in plaster. So unlike the Egyptians, they didn't waste actual objects. They preferred to leave the actual objects for the living, and they put replicas in the tombs. Here's the sarcophagus. And again, like that terracotta figure, we see this archaic smile, this very slight smile, but the gestures are purely Etruscan. We have a couple. They're intertwined together. This is a very Etruscan invention. We have this feeling of affection for one another. They're very close position. The husband is enveloping the wife. They were also very noted for their bronze work. So this is an Etruscan portrait, but it was an influence on Roman portraiture. And many of the Romans used Etruscan artists. They were highly developed artists. This is actually called verism. Verism is a style where artists concern themselves with capturing the exterior likenesses of a person. So we've seen naturalism in the Greek art, but this is another level in which it's very specific as to the actual person it is, although we only know it as Brutus. We don't have a record of who this actually was, but the Etruscans would have known. We don't know very much about the Etruscan religion at all because we don't have much evidence. This is a plan of an Etruscan temple, and it's based on descriptions by the historian Vitruvius. They definitely had Greek heroes and deities in their pantheon, hence that image of Apollo, for example. They were made out of mud bricks, and then they had a podium with a single set of steps. And the ground plan was almost square, and it was divided equally between the porch and the interior space. So this top view, this plan, the porch would be where those 4 dots are. Those 4 dots are the columns, and then the interior space, or the cella, as we learned from Greek architecture, is the space behind. So the columns and entablatures would have been made either of wood or perhaps of volcanic rock called tufa. And Vitruvius used the term the Tuscan order for the columns. They resembled Doric order columns, but Vitruvius called them Tuscan. So they really did adopt many Greek customs, and their temples were a lot like the Greek temples, but they were more conservatives. They were just on a small podium. They had access from one flight of stairs at the front of the building. So in design, it's much more practical. Again, the practicality of the Etruscans. It didn't need as many materials to be just as functional. And the Romans adopted this Etruscan sense of practicality and functionality, and we see this throughout Roman culture. So we've looked at this sculpture once before, but I want to finish this discussion of the temple by looking at it once more and then giving a comparison. So this is the Etruscan Apollo. And if we think about the Greek sculptures of these gods and goddesses, they were generally nude. And this was because the Greeks were humanists and they believed in this perfection of humanity. So the Etruscans and Romans weren't as interested in nude depictions of gods as the Greeks were. It was rather that Apollo, he was part of a group. And so it was part of a group that functioned as a group of gods on the top of the temple, and it's more dynamic than the chorus figures. So does that indicate a different kind of relationship with the gods and the Etruscans, or was it simply a practical note that because they had heavy roof beams on their temples and there wasn't much room for sculpture inside? For whatever reason, it's quintessentially Etruscan in its anatomy, in the way the drapery is carved, and in expression and hair. So here's a comparison of the Etruscan Apollo and the Greek chorus figure. And so I like to put this here because I often have students mix up the Etruscan figures and the Greek figures. The hair looks kind of the same, right? On the chorus and the Etruscan, they both have this sort of long curly braids. They both have this very slight smile, if you will, but the striding is different. If you notice, this Etruscan Apollo is actually turning a little bit as he strides. And the attention to anatomical detail, there's much more interest from that in the Greek. Not to mention the fact that the Greek chorus figure is not clothed and the Etruscan figure is. However, I would not use that as my only benchmark. Again, if we look at the sarcophagus from Cerveteri, it's the same thing. We have an interaction between these two figures. We have an emotion. Now, granted, we've seen emotion in the pathos of the Pergamene style in the Greeks, but this is more controlled, it's more constrained, it's more intimate, and it's terracotta. Here it is from the back. You can see how the two figures are grouped together, or here where the man is just enveloping his wife with affection. The arms are intertwined. I've mentioned the fact that the Roman Empire began, actually the Republic came first in about 505 BCE, so along with the Etruscans. So this is a map of the Roman Empire at its greatest extent in the 2nd century CE, where we're going to back up a little bit. There's a little bit of history before we get to this point, but you can see that at its highest point, the Romans actually encompassed all the way up into Great Britain, all the way up through France, all of Spain, all of these islands, all the way around the Mediterranean Sea, all of Asia Minor, all the way halfway around the Black Sea. It was very far extended. Generally, we divide Roman history into 2 periods, and here we go. No, this is not a history class, it's an art history class, but this is social art history consciousness, which means that the art and architecture of a people is a reflection of their history, that the people and the art are irrevocably intertwined, and you really can't have one without the other. So the Republican era runs from roughly 509 BCE to 31 BCE, and then the Empire starts in 31 BCE and goes roughly to 476. So it's a long time for the entire Roman Empire. 500 to roughly 1,000 years or so. Not so bad. I want to say a little bit about BCE and CE at this point. So BCE means before Common Era, and CE means Common Era. So, of course, this Common Era refers to the birth of Christ. 25 years ago or so, they used to say BC and AD. BC would be before Christ. AD would be Anno Domini, or after the year of our Lord. And that got changed to Common Era for various reasons about 20 years ago. So we're coming up on the birth of Christ, which happens during the Roman Empire, and it is an event that shakes history and art history to its core. So we talked about how good the Etruscans were at portraiture, and here's a portrait of Pompey the Great. This is from 30 CE. So this is a portrait actually done at the end of the Republic period, but it's a really good example of this verism that's used for portraits of politicians, such as this portrait of Pompey. Now, in the Republic, politicians wanted to show visible signs of age because it illustrated their experience, it illustrated their character, it gave them weight, if you will. So these small eyes, this furrowed portrait showed intelligence, and the Romans admired the idea of the elder statesman, of a leader. Now, another way that the Romans would use portraits was for propaganda, and propaganda is something we've not seen yet, and the idea of propaganda began with the Romans and with the Roman politics and Roman Republic. So here's one example, is that Plutarch, who was a historian from 46 to 120, he wrote that Pompey was interested in emulating Alexander the Great. So they depicted him with a cowlick, which is a attribute of Alexander the Great. So it's a heroic quality. It's, for example, it's a symbol often used to convey messages to the public. And we see this in the Republic, and we see it in the age of empire with Augustus. So here is a site from the Republican period from around 100 BCE. This is a model of the Sanctuary of Fortuna Primigenia in Palestrina, Italy. And I show it to you here because it's an example of these new building types that we have from the Romans, these new construction techniques. The Romans were the inventors of concrete, and we're going to talk more about that. They relied very heavily on the round arch and the vault, and these are all forms that are made possible by concrete. This is a aqueduct, and it's actually way up in Nimes, France, from the late 1st century BCE, but I'm showing it to you here just to continue this thought of the fact that one big reason for the success of the Romans is the fact that they were builders. And this particular aqueduct, this could produce 100 gallons of water a day for every single person in that city. So one thing that happened with Rome is that they changed from agricultural society to a commercial and a political power. And so one of the reasons that their empire grew was, once the emperors starting with Octavian, they began to call themselves Augustus, which means supreme ruler. And Caesar Augustus laid the foundation for what he called the Pax Romana, or 200 years of stability. And I'll talk to you about him a little bit more again later also. But during the entire time, the entire centuries of the Roman Empire, throughout whatever regime, through the Republic and through the succession of empires, the Roman Empire was expanding, was building, was sending armies out, building aqueducts, building bridges, building roads, building cities, and bringing their armies to these places and populating them. So there was 200 years of stability after Augustus, but at the end of that time, of course, comes a time of intrigue and terror. You need leadership, you need tactics, you need careful planning, logistical support. And there's an old saying now, Rome wasn't built in a day. So with this slide, I'm re-emphasizing all of the logistical factors that had to go into creating a mammoth empire, such as the one that the Roman Empire became. And consider this thought as well, that most of the great emperors were also builders. They began using concrete in the 1st century BCE, and so they would develop rational plans. They had builders, they had architects. They wanted to use easily worked, durable materials. So they built roads, they built legal and administrative centers, they built theaters, they built baths, they built aqueducts, they built anything that you would need to build a civilization. We need speed to move an army around efficiently. So the European highways still follow lines laid out by Roman engineers. Across Europe, there's Roman bridges that are still in use, that are 1,000 years old. Some of these aqueducts could even still be repaired and used again if they were needed. So they had these aqueducts, this system of water. And think about this, because if you can bring water from one place to another when there isn't any, you have the basis of life and you have the basis of power. So it freed the Romans from the limits of right-angle forms, from short spans. They could build large projects based on the curve. And we'll be seeing more about this concrete and this kind of building when we look at the Colosseum under Vespasian. But the early architecture began small, sort of a takeoff from the Etruscans. So we are back in the Republic now. And there are these early temples. They're very small. They had a cella and a porch at one end, reached up by a single flight of steps. So this looks very similar to that Etruscan plan, doesn't it? The cella is a little bit longer, and there's a peristyle all the way around the whole outside. We have a colonnade across the entrance. And here is that temple. It's got Ionic columns. They're freestanding on the porch, and then they're engaged around the cella. So this is standing in front of that temple. It sort of resembles a peripteral temple like the Parthenon, but the columns are engaged, so it's called pseudo-peripteral, which this is a very typical design of most Roman temples. They didn't vary from it much. They were very practical, and they had kind of a common building plan. This particular temple was dedicated to Portunus. It's in the cattle market in Rome, and it was built in the late 2nd century BCE. There's just 2 different views of it. You see the car in front of it, and trash can gives you a sense of the scale. Okay, so politicians used body language to send messages to the people. This has an outstretched arm. It's identifying this man as a public speaker. And so, as your book says, it's expressing authority and persuasiveness. Also, he's addressing the public as a member of Roman society and a Roman official. This portrait is a life-size. It's not larger than life. It's not smaller than life. It's life-size, and this particular one is bronze. They sought to create believable images based on observation. As we've seen, the portrait is important. And these are often done by Etruscan objects, but this particular sculpture, the official's name is inscribed on the hem of his garment in Etruscan letters, and that's part of how we know that an Etruscan artist did this one. Oftentimes, they would put large statues like this on columns. Here is a frieze from the base for the statuary, and this is toward the end of the Republic. It's in 70 BCE. This is one of the earliest historical reliefs ever discovered in Rome. On the left hand, we see the official registration of citizens, and then on the right side, we see the lustrum, which is a purification ceremony that involves a ritual sacrifice. So it's not a balanced composition. It's much more about verism and about telling the story than it is about a balanced composition. Now we'll look at the Roman Empire under Augustus. So again, just to refresh your memory for where Rome is, if you see the inset, you can find Rome and you can get a sense. So eventually in the next 400 years, this empire is going to extend all the way up into Britain and Scotland, all the way through France and Spain, all the way into Asia Minor and Turkey, everywhere where it's a little bit darker green. So Augustus, from 31 BCE to 14 CE, the Romans used portraits, full-length sculpture, architecture, painting, and even jewelry for propagandistic purposes. And I've already talked about propaganda a little bit. The word propaganda means to promote or discredit a given doctrine by circulating materials. So we experience propaganda every day. We go on the internet, we look on our iPhone, TV maybe, movies, other venues. We're a very technology-driven society. And again, I'm giving this lecture right now. The date today for historical posterity is November 29th, 2016. So the 2016 technology is what drives our propaganda. The Romans didn't have the internet. They didn't have TV. They didn't even have books. They didn't have paper. They didn't have newspapers. So they had to use other methods to get information out to promote their agenda. So think about this. If you're the Roman emperor and you're sitting there in Rome, how are you going to promote your agenda out to somebody that lives on a coastal town in Spain? They used portraits of their leaders, which often would include a propagandistic program of symbols that the people of Rome, and by inference the Roman Empire, would have understood. Or if they didn't understand it, it would have been explained to them, so then they would understand it. So here is a propagandistic portrait. So again, this is a survey class, so I can't show you many items. We will use this Augustus of Prima Porta, which was created in the early 1st century CE, to illustrate this concept. So this is a Roman form of idealism. It's grounded in the appearance of the everyday world because we know already that the Romans are interested in verism. This is an idealization of a specific ruler. So other rulers would have done the same thing. It's also an illustration of portraiture for propaganda. So we see here this orator's gesture of aulus metellus that we've seen already. It's also combined with the proportions used by Polykleitos' spear bearer. So this portrait is really a perfect example of how art can promote an agenda. So Augustus Caesar is Rome's first citizen. He's the bringer of peace. He's the protector of Rome. He's all these things. So in his stance, we see this Greek ideal of excellence in use of contrapposto. This sculptor would have been familiar with Polykleitos and the canon of proportions and would have been familiar with that kind of use of symbolism. We've also got the hand gesture of the public speaker, and the dolphin and Cupid at his feet are symbolizing the lineage from Aeneas, if you remember all the way back to Romulus and Remus and the legends of the founding of Rome. Not only that, he's barefoot, which means he's a hero. He's equated with the gods. But it doesn't end there. This is a detail of the breastplate from this sculpture. So Roman sculpture, we have all kinds of examples of this that you're going to see. The Ara Pacis, the column of Trajan, the Arch of Titus, to name a few, incorporated actual historical events. So as we've seen the sculpture of the Greeks, we have stories from the Iliad. They're often stories that are myth or legend. But in Roman history, we have written history from historians about particular battles and then these illustrated commemorations. So in the center of the breastplate, we have a scene of this world. We have a Roman soldier on the left. He's short-haired, he's clean-shaven, he's wearing a short kilt, and he's taking a military standard that was previously lost from a Parthian. Now, Parthia is a part of Iran, and so it's, part of the battle down in that area of the world. So he's a barbarian. He's got shaggy hair. He's got a beard. He's got baggy pants. He's the enemy of Rome, so he's a symbol for all barbarians. So this is an illustration of a bloodless conquest. I leave it to you to whether Augustus and his army rode down and defeated the wild Parthians without shedding a drop of blood. But given this illustration, those seeing the sculpture would have been given that impression. In addition, at the top, we have the sky god. He's holding up a canopy, which is signifying peace reigning all year because of Augustus. And at the bottom, we have Mother Earth. She's holding a cornucopia full of fruit. So we have prosperity. We have abundance available all year because of Augustus. We've got the sun god, Phoebus Apollo, the moon goddess, Diana. So we see cosmic forces are aligned with Augustus and his policies. So this shows a copy with the color restored. There were many of these images made. They conveyed the message of Augustus throughout the entire empire. So people couldn't read. they would make many, many of these copies, and they put them in the city squares throughout the Roman Empire. So rather than look at the news for your tabloid, you get to see a depiction of this bloodless victory on the breastplate, along with all of the messages of peace and prosperity forever. And think about this, that most people, not only could they not read, but they're just living their day-to-day life. They're not making sculpture. Most people were not artists. They didn't have time, energy, materials to make art. To see a fully life-size sculpture like this brought to the town, brought to every town. It was a message of power. They would have had an event out of it. An army would have brought these things and left them. They probably would have a festival celebrating and then leave this as the message of the eternal grace and prosperity of Rome, knowing that all people will be well governed under this wonderful figure. This is the Ara Pacis, the altar of Augustan peace. Again, it's an example of Roman propaganda like the breastplate of the Augustus of Prima Porta. So this is a war monument which celebrates the Roman victory over the Gauls, and it's enclosing a very small altar inside. There's a set of steps. So there's garlands all around the inside with fruit and flowers from every season. So the idea is that we have peace and prosperity all year round with Augusta. It's a combination of both realism and idealism. I mean, obviously flowers and plants don't grow all year, but they're real flowers and plants that grow some of the year. In the Ara Pacis, in the altar of Augustan peace, they are ideally growing all at the same time forever. It's a commemoration of Augustus's return to Rome after defeating the Gauls, and there's portraiture and allegory in its decoration. So I've got some details of some of the reliefs from this. This is the allegory of peace. On the outside, there's a message of peace, of abundance. Here we have Mother Earth holding children in her lap. It's an image of fertility, the nurturing of the Roman people. So we have a personification of the wind of the sea, citizens of Roman dominance on the Mediterranean, the winds of the land, fertility of Roman lands, abundant earth, flowers, fruit, animals. Each side has a procession of figures. One shows the imperial family, including children. There's depictions of children in official reliefs. This is an invention of the Augustan era because children embodied the hope for the future of Rome. So Augustus encouraged families to have lots of children. He gave a tax advantage to couples who had more than 3 children and penalties on men and women who were single or who were childless. So more children meant more taxpayers, more soldiers. The Romans are always thinking about the future and the power of Rome. We need taxpayers to buy the materials, to make all these buildings and bridges and aqueducts, and we need citizens to build them and man them. Here's another view of the Ara Pacis. So you can see right up the steps into the center of it in this one. Here's the detail of the south side of the Ara Pacis. Again, you notice the children. So there's double lines of senators and imperial family members, actual individuals, actual events, features from the natural world, and idealized figures drawn from the Greeks. The city of Rome was the heart of the empire, so there was a concerted effort to build Rome as a monument to imperial rule. And so here are all the different forums. Here's the Basilica Oppia back here, in the Forum of the Trajans, Forum of Julius Caesar, Forum of Nerva. The Emperor Tiberius stepped into the vacancy left by Augustus. And so the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended with the forced suicide of Nero in 68 CE. The Roman Empire itself ended after the 5 good emperors with the son of Marcus Aurelius, and we'll get to him. The last and the largest imperial forum was begun by Trajan and finished by Hadrian in about 117 CE, and they used a Greek architect, Apollodorus of Damascus. So if you sort of look at that timeline and then look at the forums, it kind of gives you an idea of the order in which these all ended up being built. So this is a restored perspective view of the Basilica Olympia, which was at the top of that last picture. And a basilica is simply a large rectangular building with a round extension at each end. And this will become the basis of the architecture that you're going to see throughout the rest of this course and into Art History Survey 2. It becomes the basis for Christian churches. So it's used it's the ultimate structure for gathering large groups of people. The last Julio-Claudian emperor was Nero. So in 64, there was a fire that destroyed almost all of Rome. And so after this fire, Nero built the Golden House, which was lavish. It was partly gilded in gold, and they've actually started excavating it. Some of it's underneath the Colosseum. So, in and of itself, this was not problematic, but Nero's timing was not very good because most people in Rome didn't have adequate housing because of the fire. They all had to live in overcrowded tenements, and they were poorly built by the government. Nero sort of sucked all the resources of the government into his own house and then just put up shoddy public housing, basically. So, because of this very bad politics, he was forced to commit suicide in 68 CE, and his general, Vespasian, became the emperor. Now, Vespasian belonged to the plebeian. He belonged to the lower class family. So now we have a man of the people, for the people, becoming the emperor, somebody outside of the box, somebody who would never have been considered as an emperor. He was just outside the bloodline. And Vespasian built the Colosseum. So we're going to talk about this for a few minutes. This is the Flavians under Vespasian, and they built the Colosseum really to cater to this public taste for wild sports. They had animal hunts, fights to the death, all sorts of different things. And that was the original use of the Colosseum, although, of course, much later it was used for other kinds of atrocities, including martyrdom of Christians. But in its inception, it was meant as a place for the people. So there's 3 levels of arcades surrounded by an attic story, and the entablature friezes on the outside of it mark the divisions between the levels. In addition, each level also uses a different architectural order, and we'll unpack that. So we have the Tuscan order on the bottom. Some people call that Doric, so depending on who your historian is. The Ionic on the second, and then Corinthian on the top. So it was his greatest architectural achievement. So as I've said, he put it right on top of Nero's Golden House. He drained Nero's private lake. He destroyed his private gardens. And again, apparently there's some pretty interesting excavations going on. And it's kind of a question because the Colosseum is covering up so much. Now, this is a piece of propaganda, and it's meant to align Vespasian and the Flavian rule with the Roman citizens. So the Romans actually named this the Flavian Amphitheater, and it's named for the 3 emperors who were all involved in its construction. So yes, Vespasian conceived it. He started building it in 72, but Titus dedicated it in 80, and then it was completed during the reign of Domitian. So Vespasian never got to see it completed, sadly. It's an example of very advanced architectural engineering. So they made it out of giant travertine blocks, which are limestone. It's a kind of soft limestone. And then it was all interlayered with other soft stones and concrete. And originally, of course, it was overlaid with marble, although over the centuries, the marble's been looted. And just, size interest thing, it's 620 by 513 feet, a third of a mile around. So a little bit smaller than the Speedway up in Bristol, the 6-acre building. So it's 3 tiers of seats and 80 entrances and seated 50,000. So it's roughly the size of the Houston Astrodome. The Bristol Motor Speedway is actually called the last great Colosseum. It accommodates 165,000. But it's very interesting to me to notice that thousands of years later, we're still building these structures. So let's take a look back at the Greeks a minute that we were looking at a few minutes ago. Because The Greeks had to build their theaters like this one on the side of a hill. They used post and lintel construction. They didn't have concrete. So if they want to build a big structure like this, they actually need to use the side of the hill to put this many seats in. A theater has to be constructed so everybody has a view of the performance. So with the development of concrete, the Romans could build this kind of structure in the middle of the city. Concrete's made out of lime, sand, and rubble, and eventually the Romans learned how to mix concrete that would harden underwater. So these 3 slides show 3 different ways that they made their concrete. They used different applications for different kinds of work. Eventually they even learned how to mix it that would harden underwater. So it's cheap, it's light, it's easily transported. A lot of times they could dig the stuff up that they needed to make it from the site that they were at. So labor was really cheap, and it didn't need to be done by skilled people, so they didn't need to pay a lot to do it. They could often have it done by slaves. So it made it possible for this incredible building program. And this slide just gives you an overview of the 3 methods of concrete. If you refer back to your book, to the section on elements of architecture, you can begin to see the way the Romans are starting to use their building blocks. You can make arches and vaults and domes without concrete, but the concrete makes structures much, much stronger. And post and lintel really has limitations for design. Usually it has to be rectilinear. So with concrete, they can use the groin vault, which is this type of vaulting that you see in the lower right, which means that they were able to make a circular structure. Vespasian also had his architects incorporate a propagandistic program, as Augustus did with the Augustus of Prima Porta and particular sculptural conventions. So Vespasian does with architectural conventions. So he uses these engaged columns, these 3 tiers of engaged columns that don't have any structural function at all. And so the ones on the bottom, we have the Doric or Tuscan order, recalling Greek society and democracy, order, simplicity, control. The second level in the Ionic order, recalling intellectual, luxury, and refinement of the high Greek society. And then the third and fourth level are the Corinthian orders, which came much later and were also much used by the later Greeks and in the Pergamene style and by the Romans. So they're all set on a podium, which was an Etruscan edition used by the Romans. So it's a building structure that's meant for all people. It sent a clear message to the Roman people about his agenda, because as Romans, they lived under a regime where a particular leader was glorified. So Vespasian and his architects created a building using these architectural conventions to convey the message that the empire was about the people rather than the glorification of a particular leader. So he's mingling Etruscan and Roman additions to Greek architectural orders, returning Rome to the people in the form of a public building used for entertainment. Sadly, Vespasian died before it's completed, so Titus ended up being the beneficiary, and it was completed after he died. This is the Arch of Titus. It was created around 81 CE, and Titus came after Vespasian. I'll tell you more about him in a minute. It's made from concrete and white marble, and this triumphal arch is a very distinctive Roman structure. It's the first time we've seen this, and it also becomes an architectural form for memorials all the way through the 19th century and even to today. So it's a formal commemoration of the victory over Jerusalem. So the reliefs inside the arch show Titus and his soldiers flaunting their booty as they carry it through Rome. So that's what you see if you walk through the arch. Very close elements are rendered with greater detail than the distance ones. So they're using very low relief for the figures in the background, and then the front figures are undercut to increase their volume. So Titus ruled from 79 to 81 CE, so 3 years. Vespasian became emperor. He handed over his military command to Titus, and Titus had this great military victory which ended the Jewish wars. He destroyed the Second Temple of Solomon, which actually is the last time the Jewish people called Jerusalem their homeland until after World War II. And Israel's created by the United Nations in 1947. So Titus's brother Domitian had this triumphal arch erected to commemorate commemorate Titus's achievement in the Jewish war. So we had Vespasian, and then Titus ended out ruling Rome for the short time, then Domitian ruled after him. So a triumphal arch is defined. Okay, it's a freestanding stone gateway. It's a gateway that doesn't go anywhere, but a gateway nonetheless, a gateway to victory, an urban ornament. It celebrates military victories, and they would actually win a triumph. So it's not just a triumph like I won and I'm triumphal. A triumph is an actual honor, like a Purple Heart. It's voted on by the Roman Senate. So when the general returns to Rome, they march before all the Roman people with their prisoners, the spoils of war. They would have a procession. So there'd be many, many of these processions, which again would support the strength of the Roman Empire. And so they would record these on triumphal arches in relief carving. And so there's many of these relief records. We'll see it at the Column of Trajan, for example. So the arch itself is all made of concrete, and then it has a veneer of marble, and all the relief panels are carved out of marble. In this relief, we see Titus, who's led by the goddess Roma. And then the winged Victory is behind him. She's crowning his head with a laurel. So we have one portrait in here. Titus is an actual portrait, but the other people in here are just generic. They could be anybody. So the idea is we have allegorical figures along with the specific figure of Titus. And then the background figures are carved in very low relief, and Titus is emphasized because there's very little behind him to distract from his figure. This relief is showing the procession in which they brought the spoils from the Jewish temple. So we've got the menorah. We also have the gold Ark of the Covenant. This is one of the last times that we've seen the Ark of the Covenant as well. So the menorah is carved in very, very high relief. It's the focal point of the procession. And the technique that they're using here is called undercutting. So if you go and look at this, it actually looks like the procession is moving right towards you. And then as it moves under the arch, the figures are carved into low relief, so it's showing that they're moving into space. The High Empire is marked by a series of good emperors, beginning with an emperor called Emperor Nerva, who adopted Trajan, who was actually the first emperor born outside of Italy. He was born in the town of Italica in Spain. And so during this period, the Roman Empire experienced sort of a resurgence of the kind of greatness that Augustus had achieved. They expanded their borders, they entered a piece of relative stability, and their last ruler, Hadrian, who was actually adopted by Trajan, was educated in Athens. He was a man of refined tastes. He was a scholar. He was an architect, and he designed a lot of his architectural constructions. This is the Column of Trajan that I've referred to before. So here, Trajan, and remember Trajan adopted Hadrian, so Hadrian will be the next in line. Trajan is commemorating his victory over the Dacians, so there's a relief on here. It's spirals like a ribbon all the way up to the top of this column, and it's an actual legible narrative. Trajan built many public markets, which is Rome's equivalent of shopping malls, and he put these columns and other kinds of memorials up throughout. Now, Hadrian is responsible for the building of the Pantheon, which is one of the best-known architectural forms in Rome and becomes the basis for Western architecture all the way through the 19th century. So this is the original Pantheon. It's the temple to the Olympian gods, or all the gods, it's called. And it was completed under Hadrian between 125 and 128 CE. The outside of it is very plain, doesn't really show us a lot of what's inside it. So it's really his greatest architectural achievement. And the facade, it's all a series of geometric shapes. He used proportions from the Parthenon, but the addition of the dome is a purely Roman invention because of the addition of concrete. Of course, it's possible for them to create a dome. He used Egyptian granite in the columns, and this is really a political statement because he could have used marble. It was very expensive and time-consuming to go all the way to Egypt to get granite, but it's a statement of power that he's able to use this resource. So here's a reconstruction drawing of it. So the whole building is made out of concrete that was built over a wooden frame. And then when it dried, they take the wooden frame out out. And so they actually changed the mixture of the concrete from the bottom to the top so that the top mixture is lighter and a much heavier mixture in the 20-foot thick walls at the bottom of the structure. And again, I reiterate the fact that these walls are 20 feet thick, that we have this, if you're interested in the evolution of architecture, it's really interesting to note the ways that architects devised in order to create these structures. So here, they reduce the point of maximum stress at the top of the dome by just putting an oculus in. Is actually an opening. It also let light in. And they reduce the weight by putting these sort of recessed panels. So they're decorative, but they reduce the weight of the dome as well. Here's just another cutaway view of it. You can see the oculus up here. Here's the center, and then the stepping of the dome on the outside. So this is as if you're looking from the outside and what you're chopping away. So it's really a wonder of mathematical harmony. They created a mathematical structure that venerated the cosmic forces that were controlled by the gods. So as the earth moved around the sun, the light would move also, and it would illuminate different niches, and the niches all would have held sculptures of the 7 planets as they knew them at that time. The Romans called the 7 planets, the sun was a planet, the moon was a planet, Diana, and then of course Mercury, Venus, Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter. So they're all planets that can be seen with the naked eye. So to them, the sun was a planet. Here you can see the interior with the light from the oculus, just this empty, luminous space with an open window to the sky. One of the reasons this building survives, why there's many, many other buildings in Rome that are in ruin, we don't have most of the buildings that the Romans made, is because it was turned into a Christian church. So the Colosseum and the buildings in the Forum, for example, were used as rock quarries, in particular the Colosseum, because there were so many Christians that were killed within its walls. It was seen as a symbol of paganism and something that should be destroyed. Now, Hadrian also built a villa outside of Rome in Tivoli, along with many, many other projects. And this is pretty interesting. It was a pleasure garden, and each section had its own individual building honoring Greek art. And he had the Athenian Grove. He had also buildings of Alexandria in Egypt. And he even had a model of the Nile River surrounded by Greek sculpture. So it was meant as a place of sensuous delight, and the canopus is meant to represent the Nile. So the whole thing covered half a square mile. And I've given you a link to a website that tells a lot about Hadrian's villa. This is a sculpture from the Egyptian section in Hadrian's villa. He ordered that his friend Antinous, who actually drowned in the Nile, become made into a god. He was the object of a cult, and so he had this statue erected of his friend as an idealized youth. But here, Antinous is represented as an Egyptian idealized youth. So this is called a syncretic image. This is a use of syncretism, combination of elements from various cultures. This is Flavian portrait. Roman patrons wanted likenesses coupled with idealization. So this young Flavian woman was given idealized features. Here's a middle-aged Flavian woman. So this is a reflection of the revival of the Verus style popular in the Republican period. So this woman is actually shown as she looked. We see the lines of age in her face.